Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Tomas Ocampo, Outreach Coordinator at Latin American Perspectives. Today we will be discussing the main theme of our January LAP issue, the return of the state, new social actors, and post-neoliberalism in Ecuador, with editor Veronica Silva. Veronica has earned her master's in Latin American Studies and her PhD in Political Science from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, and is continuing her research on elites and decentralization. Good morning, Veronica. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for your kind invitation to this podcast for our Latin American perspective audience.
So far as I've been able to tell, this issue covers the social, economic, and political changes in Ecuador since Rafael Correa's election in 2006. Can you briefly summarize for our audience the focus of the issue and the arguments presented in the issue?
The issue brings together a collection of articles analyzing various dimensions of Ecuadorian political process since the electoral success of Rafael Correa's citizens' revolution. The main dimensions covered by the contributors are fairly broad and cut across various social science disciplines like economics, political science, sociology, constitutional law, anthropology, philosophy, and international relationships. We try to cover four topics, yes. The first one is the political conflict and hegemonic dispute, accession to power of the citizen revolution. The second one is the process of the return of the state and the outline of a post-neoliberal agenda. The third is the centrality of the constitutional process and the constitutional innovation in the dynamics of change. And finally, the fourth is the environmental and social tensions over development strategy of the Ecuadorian government. Such a broad selection of topics allow us to have a global picture of the evolution of the process of political change in contemporary Ecuador and its limits and contradictions in relations to various fields of analysis. The struggle for power, the hegemonic dispute, state reform, economic and trade policy, and the international agenda. Also, a constitutional change, tension between the government and social movements, social, environmental, the new migration agenda, and the issue post-neoliberalism are addressed by descriptive but also analytical, which allow us to reconstruct an agenda picture of process of transformation since 2006.
Another area about the issue that seems worth mentioning is the return of the state in Ecuador as an impartial agent that strives to uphold the best interests of society regardless of how powerful or established some groups are. Can you elaborate more on this post-neoliberal trend and what that means for civil society groups in Ecuador?
The citizen revolution was able to implement a number of measures that had been demanded for more than a decade by popular movements. And these measures include a new social contract that allowed for redistribution of political power, the end of the cooperation agreement with the U.S. military and cancel its presence in the Manta base, ending of the contract with the U.S. Occidental Petroleum Corporation, the suspension of the FTA trade agreement with the U.S., seizure of the assets of the bankers involved in the bankruptcy of the financial system in 2000. The implementation of this measure was very important in order to abandon the failed neoliberal ideas of the so-called Washington consensus that aimed to weaken the state internal and subordinate its foreign policy to U.S. interests. We can identify four main fiscal and financial reforms that revealed the state's capacity to achieve the ambitious and promised by the citizens' revolution. It was first of all important to bring in order the state's finances, capturing a greater portion of the income earned from a strategic resource such as oil was a key decision. Another was the creation and capitalization of public enterprises in key sectors of the economy. For example, oil meaning utilities, etc., as well as the renegotiation of contracts with various transnational companies. The second was a debt restructuring. After a comprehensive audit of the external debt and declaration of illegality of certain loan agreements, the national government declared a technical moratorium of debt repayment and defaulted on a significant portion of the debt and managed to reduce the debt burden by 93%. The third was to create a new system of financial regulation and control to help national banks to finance economic development in Ecuador. The new system reversed some of the financial deregulation measures of the 90s. A particular controversial was the removal of the central bank independence and essentially putting the executive branch of the government in charge of monetary policy. The last one was a series of decisions aimed at strengthening state's tax capacity. One of the key elements was the implementation of a progressive tax policy and the need to contain the historic tax revolt of economic power elites. The reform has resulted in a 65% increase in revenues between 2007 and 2011, compared to the period between 2003 and 2006. An active fiscal policy is critical to a country in which the structure of government revenues depend largely on the revenue capacity of the state. Each of these policy innovations opened several fronts of conflict between the government and various sectors of civil society. The unions associated with banking, trade, the mass media, other private sectors did not abandon their confrontational policy toward against each of these initiatives. Tax policy opened several lawsuits against the government. Default on the national debt was denounced as setting a dangerous signal to potential lenders, which will make it harder for Ecuador to borrow from international capital markets in the future.
We have recently seen the leftist parties in Argentina and Venezuela,
Yes.
both part of the pink tide, lose to more centrist or rightist parties. And in Brazil's leftist party, which brought Luis Lula da Silva to power, is now facing some strong criticisms from previous supporters, not just the opposition. Taking a look at Ecuador, what might we see unfold within the decade in regards to the state and the new actors? And considering especially how challenges for many pink tide governments are never few in number.
First of all, it may appear that the failures of the leftist government do not bode well. However, we need first to try to understand why they failed. It was probably a combination of failed economic policy and internal oppositions to reform process since Latin American politics is inherently contentious. The government of Rafael Correa has had to overcome the oppositions from the right, but also from the far left of the political spectrum, which has led to the exhaustion of the government. Another element which we cannot forget is the very difficult external economic condition that the emerging countries have been facing for the past years and a half. The crisis in Brazil and Venezuela, for example, can be explained to a large extent by a stronger dollar and a free fall of the oil price. The success of the government will therefore and very naturally be measured by the success of its economic and social policies. So a lot will depend on how the world markets will behave in the short and medium run. On the currency side, it may be a blessing in disguise that we have US dollars as our currency. Brazil, for example, has a big dollar problem, which we will not.
Well, thank you very much, Veronica, for joining us. Your answers were obviously very insightful, and that is all the time we have for today, unfortunately. Thank you again, Veronica, for your time. And thank you to you, our audience, for listening in. Please join us again in March for our next podcast.